Hello, this is Dr. Eric Hadley again. Um, offering you guys a brief overview of the introduction in Chapter 1 of the Tom Standage book today. I'll try to do one of these for each of the chapters in the Standage book as we go forward. So I've written a brief PowerPoint here, which I hope will work in the film if I start playing it. Let's see. Um, and this first slide basically just goes over the textbook itself, An Edible History of Humanity. Um, this book covers 8 different major concepts regarding food production and the meaning of food to different world civilizations. And it starts in our prehistorical period, over 10,000 years ago, and then comes down to the present day. And so these 8 chapters each take up one issue, typically regarding human civilizations, and food. The first chapter, the one we'll be reading this week, deals with the act of farming. Farming really is a revolution in human society, and one that I think we take for granted. Standage sees it as a deliberate act, one of biological engineering of plants and animals that occurred around 10,000 years ago, and fundamentally altered natural plant life and natural animal reproduction. Chapter 2 looks at the implications of this on social structures. What happens when people stop walking around and doing as hunter-gatherers did and instead settle in permanent communities. They develop, according to Standage, hierarchies, political centralization, state religions, often in early religions with a center on fertility and gods of food. Food becomes a form of payment or taxation, both to the elites of the society and to average people. And you can see food as a symbol of power structures. Standage writes, quote, "Food was wealth, and control of food was power." So through farming, Standage views the act of farming and the settling down of people across the world, from the Americas to Europe to the Middle East to Asia and Africa, that it created the origins of world civilizations as we define them, more or less, come from the act of farming and domestication of livestock. Chapter 3 then looks at trade routes of food, particularly interest by Europeans in the Roman and to Middle Ages, and their interest in trying to get things from the Far East and from the Middle East, spices in particular. And when those routes were cut off, and we'll talk about that when we get to Chapter 3, eventually Europeans go the opposite direction across the Atlantic and stumble into the Americas. And there are many implications of that act, but the one that concerns us in this class really involves what we call the Columbian Exchange, or the exchange of food and livestock across the Atlantic, creating fusions on both sides, bringing foods that had never been used by Europeans before into Europe, things like tomatoes or potatoes, corn or squash, and cereal grains, as well as livestock into the Americas. Chapter 5 will look at global empires, particularly from the 16th to the 18th centuries, and development of global empires, which to some extent were predicated on food production and transportation, things like sugar from the Caribbean islands. And from that, we'll turn to 19th century industrialization, and the act of food as kind of the fuel of industry, particularly if we look at, say, potatoes and the role potatoes played in Great Britain and in particular in Ireland in the 19th century. And we can certainly fill the part of our course parameters of famine, looking at the Irish potato famine in the mid-19th century. And then our last 2 chapters, 7 and 8, turn to the 20th century. First, food in 20th century warfare. Food as a weapon and control of food. He looks at both 19th and 20th century wars, including the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, World War I and II, and then, of course, the Cold War. And then this last chapter, Food in the 20th Century, deals with new advances in food technology, fertilizers, GMOs, all the things that we currently have debates about, which on the one hand changes the nature of food, and on the other hand changes the amount of food produced. In addition to these 8 topics, there's a couple more that I will introduce as we go through the class. One is we'll look at the history of diets, from fad diets to effective diets, from Atkins to gluten-free and others. And then we'll also try to, what I call the Anthony Bourdain question, if you're familiar with the Food Network, and that is the connection between eating and understanding culture. So let's turn to chapter 1, the invention of farming. According to Standage, I think the major point of his chapter is that agricultural production wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was, in fact, a man-made creation. Agriculture is really an invention in that sense. It's not just an act of cultivation, it's also an active or conscious act of bioengineering or genetically modifying through choosing, through selection, a selection of the best grains and choosing to reproduce those, replant those, and cultivate those, and getting rid of less desirable ones. And it took thousands of years. And if you look at the larger history of modern Homo sapiens, say going back 150,000 years, from a roughly 150,000 BC to about 10,000 BC, that would be 140,000 years, human beings were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. They traveled over wide expanses of land. They followed rhythmic seasons of chasing wild game mixed with foraging, and in a sense some rudimentary farming. They would plant some crops but wouldn't really cultivate them. They might come back to them, or they would find certain parts of in their regions where they lived that had these crops or berries or roots and would use them. Standage says that if you were to take the whole history of humanity and make it 1 hour, it's only in the last 4.5 minutes that agriculture was introduced in human society, and that would be the last 12,000 years. What crops did mankind center their attention on? Primarily crops that provided energy, or carbohydrates. In a sense, it's the anti-Atkins diet, started over 10,000 years ago. 3 of these crops really are specific to different regions of the world. Maize, or corn, native to the Americas, kind of a wild grass that was slowly cultivated, and the textbook shows you pictures of it from just a few kernels to much larger cobs, from initially a teosinte grain to what we would call modern maize or corn. And even that is not really modern when you think of what you buy at, say, Albertsons. In terms of corn today, that's a even more modern invention. In the Middle East, and then spreading to Europe, North Africa, we see grains, particularly also wild grass. But and Standage also talks about how that was bioengineered to, particularly in 2 issues. One issue being maturation of your crops, so that they all mature at the same time for harvesting. So you had to select out ones that didn't work in the time frame you wanted, and then also the brittleness of the grains for harvesting. You wanted to make them less brittle so it was easier to collect them, so they wouldn't just all scatter as soon as you touched it. And then the third area, Asia, particularly the Far East, we see rice cultivation develop. And in all of these areas, it's roughly contemporaneous, meaning that in the Americas, in the Middle East and Europe, and in Asia, it's roughly the same time we see farming introduced of these types of crops. What are the implications of this? Well, before I get to that, there is the other issue of animals. In addition to basic crops alongside, I guess, as farming occurs and people become sedentary, they also begin domesticating animals. And this is particularly the case in places like Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, less so in the Americas, in part because there were far fewer animals to choose from. In the Old World, animals such as goats, pigs, sheep, horses, cows, chickens are all domesticated and provide various goods, so to speak, um, to mankind. And in the act of domestication, to a large sense, they also become dependent on mankind. They're no longer the traits of these animals that would allow them to survive in the wild are more or less bred out of them in order to make them docile and domesticated. In the New World, there's very few. Alpacas or llamas in South America, dogs to a certain extent, and turkeys to a certain extent, but they just didn't have the large-scale livestock options for domestication. But some of the implications of this is as people turn away from a hunter-gatherer existence and settle down, it is an act, it's a revolutionary act in the sense that you have enough security and forward thinking that you're no longer eating really hand to mouth. You are planning out, you're planting seeds that you expect that you'll be planning to cultivate for months before you're able to harvest them. And then you'll have to store them for a whole year, and you'll have to save part of that harvest for the following year. And so religion or origin stories change to some extent and become an act or a reflection of the act of farming. Food and these early cereal crops and corn become central to mythological origins of many global cultures. With the Mesoamericans, like the Aztecs or the Maya talk about the gods fashioning men from maize as God's gift. In China, Standage talks of the story of rice as a gift of the gods to humankind. And with the Sumerians and our Mesopotamians in the Middle East, we see goddesses of grain and of livestock that initially fed the gods, but also fed men. And food sacrifices become important in all of these polytheistic religions as a means to appease the gods and to thank the gods for their bounty. So that's about as far as I wanted to go for chapter 1. So we'll pause with that.